I'm a fellow of the De Nicholas Center for Ethics and Culture, and I'd like to welcome you to our morning session. I have of the fall conference. I have called you friends. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers this morning, beginning with Professor Jonathan Buttaci from the Catholic University of America. Jonathan is an assistant professor of philosophy at CUA. He arrived there in 2016 after completing his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh under James Lennox and John Henry McDowell. His research focuses on Aristotle's theory of knowledge, of learning, and of the human mind. And this morning, he is going to be offering a paper entitled, "The Servant Does Not Know What His Master is Doing, Aristotle and Newman on Practical Knowledge, Incarnate and Empty." Let's welcome Jonathan this morning.
Thank you, Colum. I love this conference ever since my days as an undergrad, so this is wonderful. I want to thank the organizers and those who've been around since the beginning to make this conference possible for 20 years running now. Places like this are the places where I first learned philosophical friendship, so I'm very grateful to the organizers and to all my former teachers. I want to dedicate this talk, however, to friends that I've been missing for the last few weeks. I've been traveling a lot due to conferences, and so I want to dedicate this talk to my wife, most of all, but also to my freshmen who are a certain kind of philosophical friend that I'll talk about at the end here. I hope everyone has gotten a handout. There's more people here than I anticipated, though it looks kind of empty compared to Alistair's talk yesterday. It is 9 a.m. after all. So please, if you have a handout, I changed the title slightly, but it'll be okay. As you know, when you submit the abstract, you have different ambitions than the paper that eventually results. So I want to begin today with a quote from that John Henry Newman repeats in The Grammar of Assent, but it was something that he wrote 30 years prior in 1841. He says that man is not a reasoning animal. He is a seeing, feeling, contemplating, and acting animal. Okay, now, when I first heard that as an undergraduate here at Notre Dame, I was worried that he was criticizing Aristotle. And so a lot of my thoughtfulness as somebody who works principally in Aristotle has wondered, well, what's Newman up to in this line? After all, he said in The Idea of a University, in your quote, you have this as your first quote on the handout, "We cannot help to a great extent being Aristotelians, and to think correctly is to think like Aristotle. We are his disciples whether we will it or no, and whether we know it or not." So there's some sense in which Newman must have thought that this expressed deeply Aristotelian thought. My thesis is going to be that Newman is more of an Aristotelian than he himself realized, at least in one really important respect, in the Grammar of Assent. So that's kind of the overarching idea that I'm going to explore today. I want to begin with the passage from John 15, which serves as the theme of the conference. "You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I've heard from the Father, I have made known to you." Okay, so what's interesting about this passage is if you just start with the servant doesn't know what the master is doing, but I've called you friends, you might think like, okay, good. I've been promoted. I don't have to do the sorts of things that slaves do anymore. But you got to start with, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." It's a very interesting passage because the Lord's friends are not excused from the deeds of the servants. They're excused from the servants' ignorance. So they're able to do the deeds of the slaves or servants, the douloi, but with knowledge. I'm going to explore later a passage in Aristotle where he makes a kind of similar contrast. But to begin with, I want to say that this passage from the Gospel clearly had an effect on Newman. In a number of his sermons, a number of his works, I just pick one from the first plain parochial sermon on holiness. I'll read this out. "If a certain character of mind, a certain state of heart and affections, that is holiness, be necessary for entering heaven, our actions will avail for our salvation, chiefly as they tend to produce or evidence this frame of mind. Good works are required not as if they had merit in them, nor if they could of themselves turn away God's anger or purchase heaven for us, but because they are the means, under God's grace, of strengthening and showing forth that holy principle, holiness or faith, which God plants in the heart, and without which, as the text tells us, we cannot see him. Outward acts done on principle create inward habits. So I want to hold on to that line there for a minute. Outward acts done on principle create inward habits. There's three terms here. Okay, now I think this is a thoroughly Aristotelian idea, and I want to look at a few passages from the Nicomachean Ethics, a work that Newman knew very well. He knew Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics very well. So this is one of my favorite passages from the Ethics. It is well said then that the just person comes to be from doing just things, the temperate person likewise. No one could ever come to be good from not doing these things. But most people don't do those, but they take flight into logos or theory. They take flight into theory, supposing they are philosophizing and will become good, acting like patients who listen carefully to their doctors, but do nothing of what they're prescribed to do. As the latter will not be made well in body by such a treatment, the former will not be made well in soul by such a course of philosophy. So you think this patient who's listening to the doctor's advice is like, give me the principle. I want the principle. But there's no outward act, right, that's done according to that principle. And so they fail to create the inward habit, which is the ultimate good. The inward habit in this case would be bodily health. But what Newman is talking about and what Aristotle is talking about is something else entirely, something more having to do with the soul, less with the body. Similarly, Aristotle, and this is something else that Newman takes from him, is that it's impossible to be truly prudent, truly practically wise, to have the intellectual excellence of practicality, you might say, without being morally good. You could have a practical theory about what you're supposed to eat or what you're supposed to do or what temperance is, but that's not really practical wisdom unless you're also embodying that theory, incarnating that theory, you might say. And finally, another passage, this is toward the very end, the last page of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says, doctors don't come to be by studying textbooks. If you know many Aristotelians, you might keep this one in your pocket to point out to them, because we often don't heed this advice. And yet some doctors try at least to speak not only of treatments, but also of how one might cure this or that person, distinguishing the conditions, right? They try to do this by just looking at textbooks. But while these things seem useful to those who are experienced, to those without knowledge, this is all useless. And he goes on to say that you might become a kind of intelligent. You might achieve a kind of intelligence by this textbook study, but you're not going to become good, and you're not going to become a practitioner. So these are all passages that seem quite consistent with what Newman is on about in the Treatise on Holiness and what our Lord is saying in the passage from John. Now, Newman knew the ethics very well. He also knew the logical works, the poetics, and the rhetoric. There's quite a bit of evidence of that. But he takes a turn from practical reasoning to theoretical reasoning in the Grammar of Assent. So he thinks that some of these lessons from the more practical domain can be carried over into theoretical study. So a way to introduce this is this comment actually in a letter he didn't send to Froude, but we have the draft or the fragments of it. He says, I've insisted on nothing more earnestly in my essay on assent than on the necessity of thoroughly subjecting abstract propositions to concrete. It is in the experience of daily life that the power of religion is learnt. So the way he sort of sums up the Grammar of Assent in one line is saying we have to subject abstract theory to the concrete. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to do what one should never do, and that is to just cherry pick a quote from the Grammar of Assent and try to learn the whole from one of its parts. But certain perils must be braved. In its notional assents, as well as in its inferences, the mind contemplates its own creations instead of things. In real assents, by contrast, it is directed toward things that are represented by the impressions which they have left on the imagination. So here he's introducing a distinction between a kind of intellectual activity that's merely notional, that's abstract, and the kind of intellectual activity which is subjected to the concrete, real intellectual activity, real assent. And he thinks that is the difference is in the imagination. The difference is, at least in large part, in how that assent is directed. In one case, it's directed at things that have been cultivated or contrived in the imagination in a kind of abstract way. In the other case, it's directed at things, real things, that have left a real impression on the imagination. He goes on to say later in that chapter, real assent then, or belief as it may be called, viewed in itself, that is, as assent, so just the assent part of real assent, the intellectual activity part, right, does not lead to action, but the images in which it lives, representing as they do the concrete. In other words, the boundedness by the real or the concrete that makes real assent real, that has the power of the concrete upon the affections and passions, and by means of that boundedness by the concrete in the imagination, they become indirectly operative. So our intellectual activity can become operative in action when it's bounded by the concrete in imagination. Okay, so that's kind of complicated, but what I want to take away from that is the idea that assent or intellectual activity as such doesn't issue an action, okay? It's something else in the imagination that allows intellectual activity to be operative. Action in this passage is a sign that our intellectual activity has been bounded by the concrete. Okay, but I'm going to come back to whether or not it's more than just a sign. Okay, so this seems to present a problem in Newman because he famously says in The Idea of a University that knowledge is supposed to be for its own sake. And if a sign that knowledge is bounded by the concrete is that it's directed at action, then it looks like the only real knowledge we can have is directed at action, and that seems like a kind of contradiction. It's also a potential problem for Aristotle, because in a passage where he similarly makes claims about knowledge being best when it's for its own sake, he seems to say that you can have intellectual activity without experience. So I want to look at that passage and kind of criticize a dominant reading of this passage. So this is the passage from Aristotle's Metaphysics, Alpha 1. He says, first off, he's describing people who are merely experienced in a domain, say in art. Those are the people who have experience with the concrete affairs of, say, medicine or building. So they have the grasp of the concrete particulars, but they don't have a theory necessarily. And so he's drawing these comparisons between the person who has the mere grasp of the concrete and the person who has, say, the art of building or the art of medicine. So he says, with a view to action, when it comes to doing things, experience seems in no way to differ from art. But people of experience enjoy even more success than those who have a logos without experience. The reason is that experience is a grasp or a knowledge of particulars, individuals, concrete things, whereas art is a grasp of universals, and actions and productions are all concerned with the individual, the concrete, the particular. So if someone were to have the logos without experience, the theory or the intellectual grasp without a grasp of the concrete particulars, and they know the universal without knowing the individual thing, he will fail in his treatment or his action. Okay, so people have read this passage to say that Aristotle is comparing the person of art that doesn't have experience and the person of experience who doesn't have the art. Okay, but if you read carefully, there's actually two distinct comparisons that he's making at the beginning of this passage. First, he says that people of art, people who have the art of medicine or the art of house building, they differ not at all from the people who merely have the grasp of particulars. Then he says that people who have experience without the art enjoy even more success than those with the logos without experience. So the dominant reading of this passage says that logos just means art, that he's switching the meaning of these words. But what I want to suggest is that he's using logos here to mean a kind of empty intellectual theory or merely abstract theory, but he doesn't mean the sort of success, intellectual virtue of art or scientific knowledge. So if you read this according to the dominant view, it looks like Aristotle's saying, well, you could have the medical art without having experience. That's not really the good thing to have, but you could have it. And in that respect, he would differ from Newman, because Newman says that all real knowledge has to be bounded by the concrete. But I think if we read this passage more carefully, in the reading I am urging, Aristotle is doing something quite close to what Newman is doing and saying it's possible to have an intellectual activity that's unbounded by the concrete. That would not issue in action, but that's not the virtue. That's not what art would be. Art would be characterized as having experience and a principle, as having outward acts done on principle. Okay. So what I want to say now, maybe something a little controversial. Newman didn't seem, by my research, some of you might have more experience in this, but I haven't found a single citation in Newman's works of Aristotle's metaphysics, certainly not a reference to this passage. And in his work at Oxford, his work focused on other works, the ethics, as I said, the logical works, but not the metaphysics. And he's even said in letters to several of the people he had exchanges with that he never really focused on metaphysical study. Perhaps most notable is in Discourse 5 of the Idea of a University, he gives the principle that all men by nature desire to know, but he doesn't cite Aristotle as giving this principle, he cites Cicero. So I find it interesting that maybe Newman wasn't aware of this passage, but it might have inoculated him against the wrong reading, because the predominant reading of this passage, even in the 19th century, was the one that I'm militating against here. So he might have been actually better able to understand this passage because he hadn't read it. Okay, so that's the controversial thing. So I'm going to back off a little bit. The less controversial thing is that he didn't really read the biological works or the scientific works. And there's two passages I want to draw your attention to from Aristotle's biological and scientific works that seem to support the reading I'm giving of the metaphysics passage and also seem to support the theory that's given in the grammar. First, from Aristotle's treatise on respiration. This is the opening line of his treatise on animal respiration, where he's dissecting fish and what have you. Concerning respiration, few of the earlier scientists have spoken, but as for why or for what purpose respiration occurs in animals, some have said nothing at all, others said something, but they haven't spoken well, since they are rather inexperienced with the facts. The way to be inexperienced with the facts, he goes on to say, is by not doing dissections, not cutting stuff up, not being experienced with the concrete particulars. Their theories were not bounded by and subjected to the concrete, and that's where they went wrong. The other passage I want to look to about Aristotle, from Aristotle, is from his treatise on the heavens, his astronomical treatise, and he's criticizing his predecessors, and he says, the people defending these theories are like people who behave just defending any argument at all. And the word there is logos again, just taking refuge in theory. They stand by any implication whatever without distinction, and they don't pay attention to the goal of theory, because the goal of productive knowledge is the work, the product, the thing that you make, and the goal or end of scientific knowledge is always what appears authoritatively according to sense perception. So what Aristotle says here is that the terminus, the end, even of scientific knowledge, even of abstract speculative knowledge, is something particular. Now, I want to be very clear on this. I don't think that means that all knowledge is for the sake of some useful end. It just means that something can be for the sake of the concrete and directed at the concrete without being directed at an end outside of itself. So this can be a friendly clarification of Newman. Although being actionable or being useful is a sign that something is subjected to the concrete, it's not necessary that things that are subjected to the concrete are actionable. In other words, it's possible for something to be concretized or incarnate while still being knowledge that's for its own sake. For Newman and Aristotle, understood on the model I've presented, something that is speculative doesn't mean that it's abstract. So this raises a number of questions for pedagogy. How do you help students not just become theoreticians and get the abstract theory, but how do you get them to be experienced with the facts? How do you help them avoid taking refuge in abstract theory and become subjected to the concrete? That's an interesting question, both in Newman studies, Aristotle studies, and in philosophy generally. It's not our question today, but I think it's a question meriting further research. I want to end by considering a powerful objection. It's one that my paper, I don't think, is the only one at this conference facing this objection, and I think Alistair McIntyre mentioned it yesterday. Buttaci, you've spoken well, you've spoken abstractly about the perils of speaking abstractly. And in response to this objection, I can only begin where I began in this paper, with gratitude, first of all, to my freshmen, my first-year students. My friendship with them and our shared inquiry helps bound the abstract and subject it to the concrete. My fellow teachers here know what I mean. The freshmen are honest and real. They're constantly turning the conversation back to the phenomena and trying to see if the theory really does fit with the facts. And I'm grateful for them for constantly keeping me on my toes and sharing the inquiry with me. I'm also grateful to my family, especially to my wife, with whom I work to cultivate the moral and intellectual virtues in my home, in our home. There we subject the speculative virtues to the concrete of daily life, but in doing so, we're not subjecting the speculative to utility. We're not putting speculative knowledge to useful ends as we try to cultivate and model the intellectual life in our children. So that's a way of making it concrete without making it useful. And finally, I'm grateful to all of you, especially to my teachers and those who've continued to make this conference possible after amazing 20 years. Kinds of people like you help us all live out the intellectual life together in a useless, leisurely, and liberal, but still concrete intellectual activity. The highest human goods and activities can be achieved that are sought for their own sake, for the sake of themselves, but gratefully not by seekers seeking by themselves. Thank you very much.
I'd now like to introduce our second speaker this morning, who's joining us from Austin, Texas at St. Edward's University. Professor Mark Cherry is the Dr. Patricia A. Hayes Professor in Applied Ethics and Professor of Philosophy at St. Edward's in Austin. His research encompasses ethics and bioethics, together with social and political philosophy. He's the author of Kidney for Sale by Owner, Human Origins, Transplantation in the Market, and Sex, Family, and the Culture Wars. He is editor of the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, senior editor of Christian Bioethics, co-editor of the book series Annals of Bioethics, and editor of the book series Philosophical Studies in Contemporary Culture. He's going to be speaking to us this morning on the topic of From Lex Orandi to Lex Credendi, the experiential epistemology of coming to know Christ as friend. Let's welcome Dr. Cherry.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great joy for me to be here at this conference, and it's nice to have so many of you here this morning. I'm going to begin with a short quote from St. John Chrysostom. He says, "It were indeed meet for us not at all to require the aid of the written word, but to exhibit a life so pure and that the grace of the Spirit should be instead of books to our souls, and that as these are ascribed with ink, even so should our hearts be with the Spirit. For that the former was better, God hath made manifest, both by his words and by his doings. Since unto Noah and unto Abraham and unto his offspring and unto Job and unto Moses too, he discoursed not by writings, but himself by himself, finding their minds pure." Christianity is not justified in terms of the good that it produces, nor is Christian belief secured by the philosophical projects designed to provide a justification of faith or to ground a set of moral sentiments. Such rationalistic supports distort our relationship with God because these argument frameworks are immanent in orientation, whereas God is transcendent. Indeed, as St. John Chrysostom recognized, God provides knowledge by revealing himself directly to his creatures. This presentation explores ways in which the rich traditional rituals of Christian life locates persons within this particular community of knowers and their experience of the one true God. I organize it into two main parts. First, I will argue that Christian epistemology is routinely experiential. It is through right worship and properly oriented asceticism that we come to know God and his commands. Such ritual activity helps one develop an intimate relationship with a personal God so that one can be illumined by him. Indeed, these day-to-day practices are likely more important than intellectual arguments for sustaining a distinctly Christian culture and its morality through time. Praying rightly is foundational for believing correctly. Second, I will argue that if one inverts this relationship, deciding first what one believes and then creating a prayer life to affirm those personal convictions, one no longer comes to know the one true God. Wrongly oriented ritual practices distort essential truths. Outside of rightly oriented faith, there is no reliable philosophical road to the truth. In short, Christ's insistence that, quote, if you are my friends, if you do what I command you, end quote, is an invitation to enter in to the mystical experience that is central to the life world of traditional Christianity, learning to pray properly so as to come to know God and thereby the proper content of the moral life. Traditional Christian epistemology is primarily rooted within the cardinal ritual practices of worship, prayer, and aesthetic disciplines, rather than intellectual argument. Christians must recognize the truth of the 4th century adage, quote, if you are a theologian, you will pray truly, and if you pray truly, you are a theologian, end quote. Richly textured Orthodox Christian rituals mark out and frame lived experiential practices. They embody a way of life that communicates knowledge of God and his commands. It reminds us of key relationships and orients us towards an interaction with reality beyond the ability of rational analysis properly to conceptualize. Such rituals express canonical understandings regarding our relationship with God, as well as the origin and meaning of the cosmos and of man's place within it. They convey essential understandings, create meaning, and bind the Orthodox community together through time and space. Together, these richly laden ritual practices embody an experiential epistemology. Christianity is a religion of worship. To know truly, one must correctly orient oneself towards God. That is, one must worship rightly. As Father George Florensky makes the point, quote, the church is first of all a worshiping community. Worship comes first, doctrine and discipline second. The lex orandi, law of prayer, has a privileged priority in the life of Christians. The lex credendi, the law of belief, depends upon the devotional experience and the vision of the church. The church fathers routinely testified to the necessity of an in-depth practice of knowing God through Christian worship and life. Consider, for example, St. Peter of Damascus from the 11th century, quote, through the wisdom and indwelling of the Holy Spirit and through adoption to sonship, we are crucified with Christ and buried with him. And we rise with him and ascend with him spiritually by imitating his way of life in this world, end quote. As Vladimir Lossky makes the point also, quote, the perfection of man does not consist in that which assimilates him to the whole of creation, but in that which distinguishes him from the created order and assimilates him to his creator, end quote. It is through right worship that Christians seek and come to know truth, where truth is not a what, but a who, the one God. This core reality frames all of Christian life. Rightly oriented ritual worship sustains traditional belief and culture. Here, the central epistemic vantage point is to be found in the union of the Christian assembly together in liturgy, where Eucharistic liturgical prayer is the mystical union of the community with God. The divine liturgy connects cosmic history and human achievement with God, grounding the moral and religious life of the Christian community. Worship and doctrine go hand in hand. To learn properly, one must stand in God's presence. As Florensky notes, Quote, the unity of doctrine and worship is strongly stressed. The doctrine itself is here not so much a doctrine taught in the classroom as a doctrine proclaimed in the temple. Theology speaks more from the pulpit than from the desk. It assumes, therefore, a more existential character. The fullness of the theological thought of the church is thrown into the worship. End quote. Such an epistemic experience is liturgical, again, not in the sense of studying liturgics, but in engaging in rightly oriented liturgy and ritual worship. This focus on the liturgy is central because knowledge of God and his commands, including understanding our moral obligations, requires that we ourselves change. The role of the traditional ascetic disciplines, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, frequent confession, and repentance, is to aid in the development of spiritual discipline, as one learns to set aside one's own passions, one's own desires, so as to acquire a will in union with God himself. Rightly oriented and guided, such practices can be spiritually therapeutic, engaging in action which changes oneself and leads one closer to God, treats the soul and cures the effects of sin, so you learn to judge rightly. As St. Maximus put it, quote, afflict your flesh with hunger and vigils and apply yourself tirelessly to psalmody and prayer. Then the sanctifying gift of self-restraint will descend upon you and bring you love. For our salvation, we must come into union with God, which requires not just living a morally upright life, but a life transformed by God. Such an experiential liturgical foundation is central to knowledge of God and his commands. Consequently, changing the liturgy, modernizing prayers so they don't offend current political interests, or altering ascetic practices risks distorting our understanding of God and disorienting us from him. Orthodox prayers embed participants within powerful and illuminating experiences. The prayers before travel, for example, disclose the relation of persons to the world and reveal the authority of God over his creation. The priest says the following, O Master, Lord Jesus Christ our God, who didst walk upon the waters as upon dry land, and disdain to have thy holy disciples and apostles as thy fellow voyagers in the ship, didst rebuke the stormy wind and command the waves of the sea to be still. Be pleased now also, we humbly pray thee, O Savior, to sail with this thy servant in his ship, allaying every unfavorable wind and tempest, and rise up special and timely winds for a successful voyage, being thyself ever unto him a pilot, and a saving, untempestuous and tranquil haven unto him and his ship, and so forth. Orthodox prayers also recognize the hierarchical nature of God's creation, which authorizes, for example, the use of animals to benefit humans. The ritual blessing of flesh meats at Pascha, for example, gives particular expression to man's place in creation, specifically referencing the blessing to eat the flesh of animals. Here I quote, look down, O Lord Jesus Christ, our God, upon these flesh meats, and sanctify them as thou didst sanctify the ram which faithful Abraham offered unto thee, and the lamb which Abel brought unto thee as a burnt offering, also the fatted calf which thou didst command to be slain for thy son who had gone astray, and had returned again to thee, that even as he was accounted worthy to enjoy thy good things, so may we also enjoy these things which are sanctified and blessed by thee, to the nourishment of all, for thou art our true nourishment and giver of all good things, and so forth. Those who deny the hierarchical nature of creation, urging the equality of humans and animals, or asserting the moral wrongness of eating meat, seek a moral reality that's separate from the church, from its liturgy and its daily prayers. Christian rituals are not merely descriptive or evaluative, but they're also performative. They mark new social status and ontological changes. With the ordination of a priest, for example, the man does not simply take on a new career. Instead, the reality of his life is changed. As a priest of God, his obligations and duties, responsibilities, and abilities are now profoundly different. Orthodox rituals embed participants within powerful and illuminating experiences, educating concepts and categories necessary to encounter and to know the world. Even within family life, for example, properly lived, it sets out essential religious understandings, orienting children and adults alike to ways of knowing the world, of understanding nature and meaning of the cosmos. Through routine prayer and fasting, liturgy, and other appropriate rituals, children learn piety. spiritual and moral discipline, proper virtues such as humility, by, for example, submitting to the authority of their parents. They learn love by watching the love of their parents for each other and for their children. As parents tithe to the church and take care of others, children learn Christian charity. By watching the marriage of their parents and attending Orthodox weddings, children learn rightly oriented love and sexuality. Even appropriate moral decision-making, such as the sinful nature of abortion, is clarified, taught, and understood through Christian prayer and worship. In the liturgy of St. Basil the Great, for example, we pray, quote, "O God, who knowest the age and name of each, and knowest every man, even from his mother's womb," end quote, which indicates a very strong basis for forbidding abortion. Throughout the entire year, the liturgical calendar guides daily life. It draws Christians into mystical participation in a life with Christ, reminding them when, how, with whom, and to whom to pray. Those who keep the traditional fasts and feasts of the church are reminded at each meal that they must live as observant Christians. Such rituals show us how to see and how to know. They tutor children and recent converts who must learn what it is they're encountering, all the while orienting believers towards God. Over time, the lessons are internalized, such that those who live within orthodoxy come to see, interpret, and appreciate the world as Orthodox Christians. Christians must learn that they are set apart. Though they live and work in the world, they must not embrace the secular or other religious assumptions of the surrounding culture. This fabric of liturgical and daily prayers, all of these habits and rituals and taken for granted dispositions sustain a community of belief across generations. All of morality must be understood and appreciated in terms of our relationship with God. Every other attempt will always fall short of the mark in some fashion. Without God, the very character of the normative claims is radically deflated. As Thomas Nagel situates the epistemic concerns, quote, "If there were a God who was responsible for the existence of the universe and our place in it, the sense of everything would depend on him. But if there is no God, there is nothing by reference to which the universe can either have or lack sense," end quote. Human experience is fragmented into numerous subjective and intersubjective accounts of reality. Absent God, there's no way to step outside of one's own particular experience to know reality in itself. As a result, there's no way to talk about an unconditioned perspective on morality. Without God, all moral claims are set within our own personal intuitions, our cultural interests, or political objectives, each of which is also always socially, culturally, and historically conditioned. In such circumstances, morality is necessarily fragmented into numerous perspectives with no in-principle method for choosing amongst the various possible alternatives. The same is true with appeal even to things like one's conscience, which has come to represent by many something like an independent access to moral truth. But there's always the real danger that one will be misled by one's passions or an errant underlying intellectual and moral culture. An appropriately objective standard is essential if we are to make judgments about the propriety of one's choices or of the serious need to repent for having followed one's conscience to inappropriate ends. Much of the so-called good, which the secular world uses to guide individual conscience's choice, Christianity knows to be deeply sinful. The background culture of the Western world affirms many practices and lifestyles that sustain selfish and inappropriate human passions, thereby darkening man's intellect and his capacity to know truly. It's often very difficult to know and to discern good from evil undistorted by one's desires. So it's not enough simply to reason well to have a good conscience. Without first knowing God, our concerns for the right, the good, and the just will be distorted by our own passions. Accounts of the moral life that do not properly recognize our relationship with the Creator will always be at best one-sided and incomplete, if not fully misguided. The priority of first knowing God is reflected in the order of the two great commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This first commandment requires that we turn initially to God, because only in terms of that foundation that the truth of any other choice can be correctly determined. If we don't first love God rightly, we will not know what it means properly and non-perversely to love neighbor as self. Here, shifts in ritual practices typically signal important changes in background religious understandings. The Orthodox marriage ritual, for example, is a performative act and is not reducible to an exchange of promises or to a contractual relationship among persons. Indeed, during the Orthodox wedding ceremony, the couple are crowned as martyrs to each other and to Christ, and they do not speak. Here, holy matrimony is revealed as a divine institution. Because of God's blessing of the marriage of man and woman, heterosexual marriage provides the remedy for sexual passions and desires that would otherwise be misdirected. When individuals live outside of the traditional rituals of married life, however, they're no longer nurtured regarding morally appropriate sexual relationships. Once society began to affirm only the very, very thin rituals of individual consent, asserting goods of sexual freedom and sexual pleasure amongst consenting partners, sexual experimentation just became the taken-for-granted experiential norm. The dominant culture of the West has ceased to recognize the unbroken Christian understanding to place all carnal sexual activity within the relationship of husband and wife. Sexual practices have been demoralized into private lifestyle choices. Marriage rituals have been changed to follow. Wedding ceremonies are often no more than a public celebration of whatever lifestyle choice or preferences the particular couple embraces. For example, the Presbyterian USA Book of Common Prayer was revised in 2018 to include a new inclusive marriage ceremony for the joining of same-sex couples. The Episcopal Church's marriage ritual stopped referring to bride and groom, but refers to this person and that person, so as to provide a gender-neutral wedding practice. Rather than revealing God's grace as acting on man and woman, the ceremony focuses on the commitment of the two individuals and what they make to each other. As marriage rituals are transformed to express this new social reality, they jettison traditional Christian understandings and culture. Other religious shifts have gone even further. The Episcopal service of renaming and the Unitarian Universalist transgender renaming ceremony give a transgender individual a new name to match a new gender identity. Consider also the women's ordination movement, which encourages people to pray in the name of God, our Mother and Father. They seek to set up their own understanding of God, to reorient individuals towards a new and different theological reality. The rituals embrace the female clergy as well as other ecumenical and inclusive forms of spirituality. Such syncretic blendings of particular personal beliefs tethered with a progressive political ideology ritualistically creates new religions and new spiritual realities. Wrongly oriented worship and ascetic practices are spiritually harmful. As Romans 1:20-31 makes clear, the failure to worship correctly leads to a darkening of the heart, a failure to know truly regarding our moral and spiritual obligations. Those who fail to turn properly to God will also fail correctly to appreciate his commands because they are blinded themselves to him. Here you might, just a quick side example, just recently an Episcopalian priestess became head of the National Abortion Foundation, and she openly describes abortionists as saints and heroes and saints. Real change. When persons adjust the content and orientation of their prayer lives to map onto new ideas or political agendas, they signal they no longer properly recognize the God who is. Such rituals celebrate the moral content individuals invent for themselves. Rituals that are wrongly oriented distort our understanding of God and his commands. To return us just really quickly to the quote from St. John Chrysostom, philosophical argument really cannot remedy what ails our fallen and broken world. Outside of rightly oriented faith, there is no reliable philosophical road to the truth. To sustain itself through time and rightly to know God, Christianity must be more than a coherent philosophical system, code of laws, or a set of ethical beliefs grounded in a moral anthropology or understanding of natural law. Orthodox Christianity carries with it a very particular way of life, marked by observances throughout the year, which are themselves a mere matter of social convention. Rather, these rituals locate humans within Christian communal time and the history of salvation. Together, these pieties and ritual practices support a distinctly Christian culture and its moral life. It is by praying rightly, embedded as within right ritual, that we learn to free our hearts from passions, so as to be illumined by God and united to him. As St. John Chrysostom rightly recognized, such day-to-day activities are foundational to coming to know Christ as friend. Y'all, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Now, I'd like us all to welcome this morning Dr. Michael Waldstein, who is joining us from Franciscan University at Steubenville, where he is a professor of New Testament. He received his BA from Thomas Aquinas College, his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Dallas, an SSL from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and a THD in New Testament and Christian origins from Harvard. He's taught at Notre Dame, Ave Maria University, and was founding president of the International Theological Institute in Gaming, Austria. Let's welcome Dr. Waldstein.
Friendship and the Trinity in John 15:15. I've called you friends. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. It was a great grace for me. Old friendships renewed. The talk by Alistair McIntyre seemed to me fantastic. That friendship is a gift in the first place, not an achievement by one's own virtue. It's a gift for me also that San Andreas can begin here and be associated with the center. Here he is as a boy with Pope Benedict, looking expectantly at something that could happen. And here it does happen. It's a gift that appears out of nowhere. And this summer he got married. These are his brothers and sisters. So it's been a rather intense summer for him. 3 points I want to address. First, the measure of friendship in John 15:15. Second, moving to John Paul, the personalistic norm and the law of the gift in his works. And then those two laws of the life of persons in Aristotle. And I'll be using as the main text paintings by Titian. He has a self-portrait when he was 80 years old. The look, an intense look at things, a remarkable look. In a letter of Pope Paul VI to Albino Luciani, the later Pope John Paul I, for the 400th anniversary of Titian's death, he wrote, gathering the heritage of this surpassingly great artist, sommo artista, we will fix our enchanted eyes and even more our moved hearts on the unexcelled religious iconography of the great painter. And we are glad to give fervent voice to our prayer before the astonishing sacred images Titian left us, documents not only of his art, but of the faith he professed and honored. This faith, as the faith of a genius of color and figure, as a master of religious and cultural inspiration, makes him present to us still today. Interesting observation, it's his faith that makes him present through his art, but it's the faith in the first place. Briefly, the paintings will be this crucifixion of Jesus alone, a resurrection, another crucifixion with the good thief, Bacchus or Dionysos and Ariadne, and do not touch me, do not hold on to me, nulli me tangere. So the measure of friendship in John. A remarkable thing about this painting is Jesus is very high up in the sky. At the bottom is a scene where everybody is leaving. He's lifted up into a dark, dramatic sky with a lightning, heavenly bodies appearing. Here at the bottom, people are disappearing. He's alone. John 15:15 in context. And in red is the measure of friendship. As the Father has loved me, also I have loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you remain in my love, as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. Going now from the bottom of the painting up, you see here on the right the skull of Adam. It's a remarkable thing here, the skull of Adam. Two women leaving, a cripple, the only one who remains behind, the soldiers disappearing through a tunnel up here. He is alone. Separated by the sun's set. At the bottom, it would be a very peaceful scene. I have said these things to you, that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be made full. It's more than simply imitation. My joy may be in you. You can see the beginning of the lightning over the arm of Christ, coming down, streaked with blood. A piece of sky opening. It's a bit like El Greco skies. El Greco seems to have worked at Titian's studio for a while. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love no one has than this, that someone lays down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. As often in Renaissance paintings, the mathematical proportions are very important. The golden section, if you take the crucifixion, the golden section, the larger portion goes right through Jesus' knees. In a very closely related image of the Assumption, it's the other way around. The larger portion is above. Above, there's space, it opens up. In the crucifixion, it's the opposite. Above, it's dense. And the continuation of the golden section from the knees up is similar. At the bottom of his arms comes the next cut, whereas in the Assumption, it's again the top that's larger. So the first cut to the knot of virginity, the second cut right to the top of her fingers. No longer do I call you slaves, because the slave does not know what his master is doing. But you I have called friends. That seems to be the emphasis. Humaste Erika. Puts it first, humaste. You I have called friends. Because everything I have heard from my Father, I made known to you. There's a golden chain connecting exemplars in the text that we just looked at. As the Father has loved me, so also I have loved you, and love one another as I have loved you. If one puts it as a chain, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you, and as I have loved you, so love one another. That's the golden chain of both fact and morals in the Gospel of John. The typical Titian halo, which is in the cross form in all of his portrayals of Jesus. How does the Father love? That's the question. Some important texts on this. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. Characteristic of spousal love is a kind of totality of gift, not present in every friendship. The Father loves the Son and has given all things. into his hand. All is again the measure. The Father loves the Son and shows him all that he is doing. Because of this, the Father loves me, that I lay down my life. Very similar to all. And in John 17, all that is mine is yours, and yours mine. This painting appeared out of nowhere less than a year ago, discovered in a private collection. It doesn't actually know who it belongs to, but it was published and seems to be by Titian, early Titian, the resurrection. You can see the sun rise with the clouds illumined from below, a counter image to the crucifixion. There you see the sun illumining the clouds from below. He stands completely with strength. In a remarkable passage in John 17, and there's a parallel in John 13, the exemplar gets unfolded. If you put the three next to each other and they're patterned in the same way, they cover the future, the present, and the moral norm. I do not ask you for them alone, but for those who believe in me through their word, that all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they too may be in us. It's not just imitation, but a direct relation to the exemplar. That the world may believe that you sent me. So the unity is conceived of as a visible sign, as a persuasive visible sign, that the world may believe that you sent me. Then the present fact, something happened objectively. And the glory you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may be completed into one, that the world may know that you sent me, and that you loved them as you loved me. It's again the visible sign of the glory. I gave you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you too may love one another. In this all will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. More in detail, the illumination from below. Paintings have a different way of speaking, silently. If I say something, I apologize. But Titian is a major theologian. Now, the personalistic norm and the law of the gift in John Paul. A different type of crucifixion with the good thief. Jesus is dead, the good thief looking over his head to the promise. A perfectly shaped Greek body, and the expression of longing in the good thief's face is remarkable. In John Paul's work, Gaudium et Spes 24 plays a crucial role. He quotes it all over the place and says about this text, it contains the whole truth about man and woman, about love between man and woman. Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prays to the Father, that all may be one as we are one, so on the same topic that we just looked at, offering vistas closed to human reason, indicates a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the union of God's sons in truth and love. This likeness shows that man, who is the only creature on earth God willed for itself, cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of self. John Paul sees two principles here. The only creature on earth God willed for itself, God wills our good for our own sake, but we only find ourselves, and that's our good, through a sincere gift of self. And at the end of that text, the Council quotes Luke 17:33. Whoever seeks to make his life secure, peripoiesastai, to do around one's life, like a palisade or a fence, will lose it, but whoever loses will make it live. Can certainly be qualified as loses. Now, commentary from Wojtyła, Love and Responsibility. God wills man for himself is equivalent to what Wojtyła calls the personalistic norm. Persons should not be used as mere means, but treated as having their own ends. Different from Kant, who says they should be treated as ends. Wojtyła explicitly corrects having ends. Big difference between being an end and having an end. This norm stands at the beginning of the life of persons. It arises from rational nature, due to which persons can know and pursue the good. In the face of Jesus, the eye is simply a black triangle. The poverty of means he uses and the expressiveness of them at the same time is I find, extraordinary. The second law, the law of the gift, cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of self, concerns the end of the life of human beings. It's a matter of fully finding, of perfection. And perfection is reached at the end. Look at the white line on top of the head here. Remarkable what the intensity it adds to the shape of the head. Many details that are remarkable. This is now Wojtyła himself writing. Christ expressed, the person can give himself to another person, both to a human person and to God. And through this giving, a particular shape of love, which we define as spousal love, is formed. This also testifies to a particular dynamic of the person and particular laws governing his existence and development. Christ expressed this in the sentence that seems to contain a deep paradox. Whoever wants to save his soul will lose it, and whoever loses his soul for my sake will find it. We've already stated that this perfecting of oneself comes through love and together with love. The fullest and, so to speak, the most radical form of love consists precisely in the fact of giving oneself. The gospel emphasizes this vividly and decidedly. Will lose, will find, to save, to lose. We evidently discover in it not only the personalistic norm itself, but also very detailed and bold instructions that develop this norm in various directions. Now to Aristotle. What painting should one choose for Aristotle? Titian's pagan paintings, and that's a separate part of his work, would be, this is the god Dionysos and Ariadne, the god of wine, marrying Ariadne. His engagement present to her, a constellation of stars, is up there. But we'll go back to the crucifixion, in fact. Of the love of lifeless things, we do not use the word friendship, for it is not mutual love, nor is there a wishing good for the other. That's much like the personalistic norm. So the good thief, I think, may be a good symbol for Aristotle in this context. 1 minute. One doesn't wish wine well, but for a friend, one wishes. To be friends, then, they must be mutually recognized as bearing goodwill and wishing well to each other. And here comes the second aspect. To the extent that they have communion, so far there's friendship, koinonia, and thus the just. Minimal means to express longing, but it's clearly, is now the question, can there be friendship between the divine and us? If there's a great distance of excellence, they are no longer friends, but do not even expect to be so. And this is most obvious in the case of the gods, for they excel most in all that is good. There's no exact marking of the boundary in such matters. Up to what point they are friends. So here, it seems friendship is impossible. In the scene of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, Nulli me tangere, that is very much a theme. She looks at his wound, even though overtly, on an overt level, it seems to be her hand protecting Jesus' genitals that are in the center. But really, her main attention is to the wound. Very different relationship. Now, the text in which Aristotle does hold that it's possible for friendship to exist between God and us. The dynamics of the picture. Of course, there's no account of the Trinity in Aristotle. This text seems to come in some way close. He's talking about ripening of fruit. When is it complete? When the seeds in fruit are able to produce another such as itself. For in all other cases as well, we describe the perfect in this way. Here's my conclusion, simply a repeating of the images. Thank you very much.
Now we have a few minutes for questions. There are microphones here at the front on both sides. Please, when you're ready, I'll call on you and you can direct your question to the speakers. Please.
Hi, thank you very much for the talks. I have a question for Professor Cherry. So you talked about how worship and doctrine are like basically go hand in hand. They're linked. So do you think that a radical change in worship, in liturgy, inevitably leads to an attempt to try and change doctrine?
So the idea is one has to be very careful how one prays. And very careful to whom one prays, because insofar as you make inappropriate changes, it can disorient in bad ways. That doesn't mean that no changes are ever permissible. For example, I go to an Antiochian Orthodox church, Arab roots. The liturgy, though, is done in English, but it's not done it wasn't just sort of a random translation into English. It was a translation which was very carefully walked through and to make sure it still captured what was necessary, what was appropriate in the liturgy, without changing or disorienting us from it. So one has to just be very careful, because if you first decide sort of, I believe this, and I'm going to change my prayers to reflect that, then instead of orienting the right way, you disorient towards something else. So depends on what you mean by change, but I mean, translation is obviously some kind of change, but it has to be done very carefully and very precisely. Otherwise, it really will shift you away from the Church of the Fathers. Yeah.
I'm Michael Platt, Friends of the Republic, for Mikhail. George Simmel, in his book on Rembrandt, observes that when you look at Rembrandt's figures, all of his figures, death is present in them, whatever age they are. Whereas by contrast, when you look at Renaissance portraits, even Saint Sebastian with arrows through him, he's really not mortal. He looks like he's going to keep going. You've revised my sense of this opposition in your first paintings of the aged Titian, of which you more or less said, this is a man who knows he's mortal. You've taken most of these images, and even the criminal, they're always portrayed with these heroic bodies that have this persistence. And I wonder if you've thought about this, these differences.
Clearest, of course, in the crucifixions themselves and the figures of Jesus, who is dead. And there's a paradox in the good thief, in that he is very much alive. He seems barely to be hanging from the cross, but more floating in front of it. Mm-hmm. And there, a Renaissance ideal of the body in its glory seems to be realized, but you know he's going to be dead in a few minutes. And above all, the look of longing for the promise. There it's clear it has to pass through death. It can't be the continued existence of this glorious body except after a threshold, a decisive threshold. Mm-hmm. In Bacchus and Ariadne, or Dionysus and Ariadne, there it's different. There, yeah. Got it. You see, though, here in this painting, in the background, at the vanishing point, there's a church tower. Mm. It's the reception of an ancient image into a Christian context. Mm. And the church tower points to the promise, it points up. Mm.
What about the Mary Magdalene? Steinberg's book, The Sexuality of Christ in the Renaissance, very interesting book. And you alluded to this, that is, the hand seems to be, not quite sure, moving toward the genitals. What is the meaning of this?
It seems to me that the painting, on a first glance, leads you to the sexual theme, do not touch me. And her hand stops, and there are these layers of protection. Yeah. But in fact, when you look more closely, the main event in it is that she looks at his wound. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's not a sexual object at all. And that's the look of faith.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's thank our speakers this morning.